And there's no risk of forest fire here.
No. Indeed.
You'll be underwater soon, but no risk of forest fire.
Choose your weather event. It's so good to have you guys here.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. As everybody arrives. Looks like we've got some familiar faces joining us. So glad you guys made time. I'm Stacy Caldwell. I'm the CEO of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, and welcome to our Forest Futures Salon series. I'll walk you through a little bit of an intro here, and then I will hand it over to our facilitator, Teal, to do the introduction of our esteemed guest speaker today. So you have landed on another Forest Futures Salon. We've been doing these for about 4 years. Your host this afternoon is the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. Our mission is to connect people and resources and generate more opportunities. I always flip those to build a more caring and creative and effective community. So we like to say we put smart people with good ideas together, match them with resources, and make great things happen in our community. And we have an amazing group of board members who oversee the work of our foundation, of which today I see Kristen York, and I'm looking to see if there are others that might be with us today or joining us along the way. And then we also have an amazing team on staff dedicated to facilitating the mission of TTCF. And again, many of them have joined us here today with this inspiring conversation. So the Community Foundation is known for getting money out the door to important work that needs to take place through our grants and scholarships throughout the year. And 2020 was a doozy. With COVID-19, we turned what was usually a grant cycle every year into 5 grant cycles and a pretty enormous and inspiring scholarship cycle. And so we're very proud of that work. And our team worked very hard to make sure those dollars went in the right direction for the enormous need. We also have initiatives that are part of our strategic plan. These are areas that impact our community that no one grant, no one nonprofit can really affect change. And so these are where you see the TTCF lean into collaborative models, convening around family strengthening and accelerating housing solutions, and protecting our forest with market-based solutions. And so that is the initiative that we're focused on here today. And the through line of our initiative work is really thinking creatively, not only in how we can deploy grants, but also through impact investing. And we have some great examples of what we've done in the past, as well as kind of ideas of where we're heading in the future. But what we're here to talk about and learn is really related to the forest. And our work in the forest goes back more than 10 years through an endowment that was established at TTCF called the Nature Fund. And through that work, we've given grants to many organizations that are doing the hard work, building solutions for this beautiful natural environment in which we live. And beyond those nonprofits, there's key players that have been invited to our Salon series that we have hosted over the last 4 years, in which in which we really wanted to learn from ways in which the Community Foundation could not only use our grant cycles and partnering with our local nonprofits, but to really think differently about advocacy and policy and different forms of financial capital within private companies, within an entrepreneurial ecosystem, so that we could really take a blended approach and tackle this in a more systemic way. So here, what you are seeing is kind of our reality of where we live right now, and California. This is the situation we're in. We have an overcrowded, densely packed, dry forest throughout the Sierra. We have hundreds of millions of tons of biomass that has been piled up after thinning, waiting to be burned. And it will, either burn by prescribed burn or unfortunately wildfire. And we have seen the impacts and devastation on communities all around us. And it's really what keeps bringing the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation kind of to our North Star of why we're doing this work. And it's ultimately to protect our community. Last year, 2020's fire season was the worst on record. We had a state on fire on top of a global pandemic. 5 of the largest fires in California's history ignited last year, with more than 4 million acres burned, larger than the last 3 fire seasons combined. There was 112 million tons of carbon dioxide emitted. And we feel that, unfortunately, this is likely to get worse before it gets better. And so we continue to keep our heads down and a constant drumbeat on how we as an organization and as a regional community can educate ourselves, engage key stakeholders, and convene our community around these issues. We work hard to mobilize resources through grants. We currently have a matching grant right now that's helping us do this programmatic work. We're looking at raising catalytic funding to accelerate solutions through a Forest Venture Lab model. This Forest Future Salon series has been curated by Teal Zimring, who really brings a wealth of knowledge, a network, and a passion for this work. And this year she has designed the Salon series in 3 different tracks so that we as the ones being educated can both focus on the market-based solutions. We can look at regional efforts and collaborations that are driving restoration. And then where you have joined us today in kind of more of, the storytelling aspect of our work and of the forest. And so this gives us an opportunity to really kind of unpack a different type of conversation than we've had in the past, and we've been really looking forward to it. So with that, I want to hand the program over to Teal and thank her for all her hard work, and to the team at TTCF and behind the scenes with this. And we really look forward to today's discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces and also some new faces today. So that's very exciting to me. Thanks for being here. First, the smallest bit of housekeeping, which is today, I hope that we will have an energetic and engaged discussion, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer at the end. But as we go, if things occur to you, if you have questions, if there's places where you want to jump in, throw those in the chat or send them to me. Or if you feel so compelled, unmute yourself and jump on in, and we'll navigate that together. I'll track all of that and then call on you when there's opportunity to discuss so that we can hear everybody's voices. Thanks, Stacy. It's such a privilege to be here. And let's just start with what we all are actually here for, which is Zach. Zach, it's a privilege to have you here. Zach is a reporter, science reporter who has written for The Atlantic, for Outside Magazine, for several publications with which we are all familiar. He's also a fellow UC Berkeley alum, and we've had some really engaging discussions leading up to today's conversation. He is a poetic author about the science and the history of the land in which we live. So thank you, Zach, for being here. And I would love to start with a softball question. What drew you to this work? What are you passionate about with regard to the trees? And what was your journey to the trees?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. What excited me, I guess, I think trees, what excites everyone about trees is that they're really tall and big, and they're kind of the plants that we notice. So I think people who are not particularly botanically inclined, which was myself for a long time, are really good at noticing trees more than other plants. I think the other interesting thing is that they're also really old often. So they're kind of this, a bit of a bridge beyond the normal human experience. So there's always kind of been this metaphorical weightiness to trees. We have all these, inspirational poster type quotes about, planting trees for the future. And, it's really cliched at this point, but it's also true. And it's also inspiring. So, I think trees are a worthy subject, I guess. And how I got into it really and into this question of how forests are changing and moving. Like I say, I wasn't particularly botanically inclined. I was just a reporter. And I think in 2014, kind of at the height of California's big drought, there was a story in the New York Times about basically the giant sequoias were, in some parts of their range, were suffering the effects of the drought and kind of by extension, climate change. And I just thought it was really interesting. I visited them when I was a kid and, kind of was familiar with them. They're kind of the biggest and among the oldest and tallest trees. So they're kind of everything we like about trees taken to this ridiculous end. And anyway, so I mean, the fact of climate change affecting these trees is like, okay, so what does that mean? It kind of means, maybe the places where they currently exist are not the places for them, and the places they exist are getting less suitable for them. And so I kind of ended up on this rabbit hole, just kind of obsessed with this idea of trees being this vessel to understand how the world's changing, and really, again, trees are kind of this bridge into the future. So what is the future of trees? And what does that tell us more broadly about our future as well?
You mentioned trees as a vessel to understand the way that the world is changing. And in your book, you wrote that for a long time, people assumed that if a plant was existing in a place, that was where it has always been. It was where it was supposed to be. And then you also tell the story of plants and entire groves that are uniquely and oddly out of place and somehow seemingly where they are not supposed to be. And one of those is right here in our backyard in Placer County. And it's a really incredible story that you tell in your book. Would you tell us about the Placer County Grove and that concept of a tree possibly being not where it's seemingly supposed to be?
Yeah. And so we do have, I think, some pictures.
Oh, yes. Photographs.
It's not as good a slideshow as Stacy's, but I pulled it together. but yeah, so I think that's General Sherman. It's like the biggest sequoia. So obviously, people are quite impressed. There is this group of giant sequoias in Placer County, and I wanted to talk about it today because it's something I've been obsessed with, this little group of sequoias, and it's local to you guys there in Tahoe. It's I think it's maybe 25 miles east of the lake, or west of the lake, sorry. So everyone kind of knows the story of the Donner Party. They, sort of headed west and took a detour and got stuck in the snow near what is now called Donner Lake and had a really awful winter. And so this group of sequoias has a kind of funny, similar story in a way. So I think, maybe we can show the next slide. I think shows the location of this grove. So there it is. Yeah, it's 25 miles east of the lake, west of the lake. I don't know why I keep saying that. And it's very remote, I can tell you, because I just went there. Can we show the next slide? It should be a map, another map. So here you can see all the groves of sequoias. There's like 70 some groves, and they're kind of scattered kind of in the middle heights of the Sierra. So you can see that down south, they're much more concentrated. And as you get up towards Yosemite, they get really scattered. So there's Mariposa Grove kind of in the middle. Then you have Calaveras big trees. And then way up there by Lake Tahoe is the Placer County Grove. So I've wanted to go there for years. I've been kind of obsessed with giant sequoias in general. I've visited a ton of groves. I've climbed to the top of one, which I describe in the book. But I had been not able to get to the Calaveras Grove just for various reasons, the Placer County Grove. Until last week, I actually made it out there. And I think, I guess I skipped a slide, but anyway, so yeah, maybe the next slide. There we go. So that's the distance to the Calaveras. So you can see that it's the northernmost grove and it's the most distant from every other grove. So it's 50 miles as the crow flies, like 150 miles if you're driving. So now we could go to the next one. So there's me next to the trees. I realized in the course of this book, you never look cool standing next to trees. So I just gave up. My buddy and I, we drove up there. I think it's maybe an hour out of Forest Hill, on this little windy road. You hit a gate and, we followed, snowcat tracks for, I think, maybe 5 miles, and then put on snowshoes and hiked another mile into this grove. And what you see is basically the grove. So it's like 6 adult trees, just in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by pines and firs and incense cedars, and Doug firs. I think we can do the next one. Oh yeah, nice. Picking up a pine cone. This is a giant Doug fir, so it must just be a good place for trees. But so anyway, it is totally bizarre. You go totally in the middle of nowhere, and then you find this group of 6 sequoias. So the question is like, how did they get there? What are they doing here? The nearest member of their species is 50 miles away. So it's this really fun picture of how trees move. And what people used to think, so like John Muir, when he was considering this question, is how do these sequoias get to these places? Why are they so scattered? Why are all these groves so scattered? He thought that the glaciers had come in and split this continuous forest apart. So they used to all be in a string, and the glaciers came in and split them apart. What modern scientists think happened is that the reason they're so far removed from each other is they actually took different routes over the mountains as the mountains were rising 3 or 4 million years ago. So the reason I brought up the Donner Party is because, obviously some routes are better than others. This group of trees they're super inbred. They're almost a clone. There's only 6 of them left. And they're not reproducing. So basically we caught them. It's like we came upon these trees right now, kind of like spring for the Donner Party when the rescuers show up. It's just an awful scene for the people or trees involved. But I just thought it would be fun to talk about with you guys because, it's kind of a local example. It's a place where you can really see how trees have moved and really visualize it. How these things seed by seed would split and go different ways and often wind up in places that, as the climate continues to change, are less than suitable. So that's just the little story I wanted to tell about that.
I love that you made it there just last week while we were all, anticipating the end of the winter and the beginning of spring. And then we're telling this story about the springtime of the Donner Party and these poor trees. And thank you for the photographs. I'm curious to take that kind of historical perspective on how these trees wound up so alone in a way, and to ask you about another theme you explore in your book, which is the distant future of our trees. And the question that you approach in your book as to the degree of human intervention to help trees in that journey. If we can now predict and look out at the distant futures, what is our role in participating in that distant future as humans? And there's two particular areas that strike me. One is that you quote Michael Williams in saying, human progress had seemed to be viewed in some proportion to the amount of woodland cleared, or at least the amount of wood used. And because the majority of the human population lives in the northern hemisphere, there are those that posit that to save species and to save trees, you must send them southward. So that's an interesting theme about the distant future and our relationship to it that I'd love to hear more about. And the second is a similar though different story was that of the Brewer spruce that you tell in your book, a rare species endemic to the Klamath Mountains of northwestern California, near extinction here in California and potentially hospitable to conditions hundreds of miles northward in Canada, years and years from now. But they're not going to make it there naturally. So do we engage in that process and get them there naturally before that time? What are your thoughts on the distant futures and the human relationship to that?
Yeah, I mean, the central question of the book is, should people step in and help trees move to places that we think they'll be better suited to in the future that they may not be able to arrive at on their own? There's a debate about whether that's a valid or wise conservation method. You mentioned kind of the clearing of the forests. Humans have always, probably long before our agricultural days, we've always moved species from one place to another. It's kind of a fundamental human experiment. Take this thing from here, move it over here. What happens then? It's kind of this collective experiment. But it really took off with agriculture, which is, of course, trying to make new places favorable for this species that wasn't there in the beginning. So, there's a bunch of trees there now. Maybe we could grow wheat there or barley or whatever. Cut down the trees, plant something else there. And so in that process, in that collective process, we've cleared half of the world's forests. So this is a huge experiment in moving things, rearranging life on Earth. As a conservation method, though, it's fairly controversial because, we have, over the last century, seen a bunch of examples of where that's gone really badly. I talk about several examples in the book, one being the emerald ash borer, which is currently killing off millions and millions, hundreds of millions of ash trees all across North America. I don't think it's arrived in California yet, but it's been stopped at the border, so presumably it eventually will get there. American chestnut is another famous example. American elm. These new species have come in and killed off these old species that we really liked. So it's a classic story. Humans move things from one place to another, and it goes terribly. But the modern debate is that basically we have all these species of plants and trees in particular, which are very slow to migrate. And scientists have worried since the 80s, really, that many species would not keep up with the rate of change and could face extinction from that. And so there's been this push to then practice assisted migration. And so then the question is, to your question, can we predict the future? Can we predict where these things want to go? Can we predict that they will not become invasives themselves, or have some awful, ecological or even cultural effect in the future?
It it's so compelling, and I have to say I'm constantly impressed by any reporter or author in your ability to ask the question and not rage against the machine to say what's the answer. In your book, you interweave this distant future with the scale of a single human experience quite frequently, both in the telling of anecdotes, in the telling of how you researched your story and how you went about telling your story, shifting back and forth between kind of unfathomable timeframes, both historical and future, and then also what's happening this year, what's happening right now. It'd be great to explore, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I think we all would, how you made the choice to weave your stories this way, and what you see to be the value of enmeshing the time frames in this way. I'm really thinking about the Goldilocksian discussion that you have in your book. Could you explain what that is for folks who may not have seen that piece of it and jump in there?
Right. And just to your earlier point about not raging against the machine, it's very much a question for me always, just because like I think I'm just by nature like never I like hear both sides and I'm like, I don't know, I guess they're both sort of right. It's not to say I don't have opinions, but as a reporter, it's easy to kind of inhabit the uncertainty. And I mean, that's, you know, that is the question is like, what is the future like? What's it going to be like? We have kind of various methods of getting at it. One being models, where we kind of take a small facet of the world as it exists today and try to reproduce it by mathematical or other means, and then potentially send it into the future and see what it does in that future. The other method would be fossils. So what has happened in the past when the climate has changed? How have species reacted? And in both of these methods, we kind of assume, you know, a uniformitarianism. So like how things act in the past and present are probably how they'll also work tomorrow. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of talking about those time scales, obviously you can look really far back in the fossil record, and you know, if you go back to the Pleistocene, 11,000 years ago, you can see that the arrangement of forests was completely different. You know, ponderosa pine, which I believe is a pretty common species there in the Tahoe area, was confined to Arizona, southeastern Arizona, and maybe New Mexico. Very rare. You would have looked at it at the end of the Pleistocene and said, oh, you know, that ponderosa pine is in danger of extinction. And now it's all over the West. So you look at a time scale of 11,000 years and you can see that there's massive changes. The climate changes and the arrangement of species completely changes too. So that's like the big macro distant time period. But then, yeah, like Stacy was laying out, there's the kind of year by year way that happens. And so, I mean, one way that forests change is they burn and then something else comes up afterward. So like last year, if you had, you know, 5 of the biggest fires in California's history, recorded history, you know, that's quite a powerful lived experience for the people who experience it. So you can, I guess for me, what was interesting is like looking at these two time scales and trying to reconcile them. So like, how do those fit together? We know that in the past, when the climate has changed, the arrangement of species has changed. Some species get more common, some get less common. The places they live change. And so then, you know, I guess you can sort of imagine that in living a fire year like 2020, it's just smoke all summer, it's kind of awful. Is that how that sweeping change happens? I mean, are these the years in which that rearrangement occurs? I hope that answers your question or gets at some part of it. But yeah, I mean, you know, that's the question, is trying to reconcile kind of these two different time scales.
And you mentioned Unitarian uniformism, and what that makes me think of is if there's this default assumption that how it was is how it will be, and yet we might be in the years when it is profoundly and fundamentally changing. How do we address the discrepancy in sort of the bias to not take action because we assume how it was is how it will be, unless of course we are in those years when it is the moment of sweeping dramatic change? How do we change our mindset and find a way to shift our bias to be a bias toward action if relevant? So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and you know, the sort of action piece of it, I suppose, is that you know, there's kind of yeah, we've had 10,000 years of relative climatic stability. Our entire civilization is built on the idea that the climate is kind of unchanging. So yeah, I think it's really hard to break ourselves out of that point of view. It's we've built up our shorelines, we've built into our forests, we've taken all these actions that sort of assume underlying stability. So, but you mentioned the Goldlocksian perspective. I think there is kind of this period of the future that we can really have an impact on. Like tomorrow, we're probably not going to have too much ability to like drastically change what happens tomorrow because it's probably already, the inertia is there. It's probably mostly going to happen as it was going to. 10,000 years into the future, similarly, we probably don't have a whole lot of sway over. But there's this period, and it's that kind of 20 to 50, maybe 100 years when we can kind of have some leverage and have our most effective actions. And so just to bring it back to that kind of symbolic aspect of the trees, you plant a tree now and someone will be dealing with it in 100 years. So that's kind of, forestry and kind of talking about your community forest is a really sensible and immediate way to kind of have an impact and decide how you want your community to look in the decades and century to come.
I keep coming in my mind to what you said. This is a huge experiment in rearranging life on Earth. And then, what does that mean at a community scale? And I have two more questions for you. And after that, I would love to open it up and hear questions from others. I have already received a couple. One of my questions for you is about the sixth chapter of your book, for those who have read it, which is called The Future. And the first few paragraphs of that spoke profoundly to me as I read it, and I'm guessing that may also be true for others when they reached that part of your book. I want to lean into another question, but let me ask you this, and feel free to say no. I'd love it if you might just read to us those first paragraphs of The Future from chapter 6 of your book. And I know I asked you that beforehand, but I didn't wait for your answer.
That's okay. Let me find it.
It's such as you look for it, what I find so compelling is your description of the beauty of wood and the entangled way in which it evolves with its landscape. And as we think about our role as a community in the forest in which we live, which is the purpose of this series, which is the work of the Community Foundation, you beautifully describe the role of the plants and the land with one another and their coevolution. And so if you've found it, please take us into it.
Yeah, sure. So you just wanted me to read from the beginning, for a few paragraphs?
Yeah, just those first 2 paragraphs.
Okay. So the chapter is titled "The Future." The 2 defining characteristics of a tree, its height and its woodiness, are entwined. If a tree were not woody, it could not grow tall. The cell walls of all plants are built of a material called cellulose. Cellulose is strong under tension. Like an inflated balloon, a cell made of cellulose will pull taut when flushed with water. When the plant made mostly of cellulose dries out, though, the tension is released and the plant wilts. Cell walls of woody plants are also made of cellulose, but they're fortified with a substance called lignin. Lignin is strong under compression. A lignified plant cell is like a Lego brick. Stacked together, these cells can defy gravity. The resulting material, wood, is mundane in purpose, but miraculous in practice. If all of the greatest aesthetes, I don't know how to say that word, and engineers that ever lived were assembled in some heavenly workshop and commissioned to devise a material with the strength, versatility, and beauty of wood, I believe they would fall short, wrote Colin Tudge in The Tree. Wood is one of the wonders of the universe. Some wood is so soft that a person can pinch it between 2 fingers and leave prints. Other wood fills saw teeth and drill bits. Some woods are strong, others light, others flexible. There's fragrant wood and resonant wood, and wood that's best for grinding up and digesting into paper pulp. Some wood, it seems, is built to last forever. Walking among the bristlecone pines in California's White Mountains, I noticed that many of the trees were posed like dancers missing their partners. Thousands of years ago, they'd grown over rocks long since eroded away.
I love that. That is beautiful. And you write, civilization sits on wooden joists. And the last question I have for you, which stems from that, as I mentioned, our work here and our objective in coming together is to understand our role in relationship to the forests and our opportunity to both steward and heal this landscape and to protect it as we grow in it and with it. And so the last question really is, what do you view to be the responsibility of an individual toward the forest? And I know you and I spoke about this, so I'm just going to leave it there.
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where I think it's a question book, probably more than an argument or an answer book, just because I think I'm still a little uncertain on many of these things. And one of them, I mean, that question is like, what is our responsibility to the forests? It's kind of a kind with, what is our responsibility to other humans, to every other species? I mean, what does it mean to be a person alive, kind of in a moment when we know that our very existence is quite hard on the planet, and by extension, every other species. So I don't know. I mean, it's. I wish I had a good answer, a concise answer for what our responsibility is. I think one thing we could do, maybe when we are thinking about the forests and what we want forests to be in the future, what we want for them. I think one thing that I sort of came to understand in the process of writing this book is just that, we could take a little broader view of how they are and how they will be. I think we know that what has happened in the past is that when the climate changes, the arrangement of species changes profoundly. And like I say, some species become rare and others become more common, and the arrangement changes and you have every species going which way. So you wind up with odd biogeographical curiosities like the Placer Grove, Placer County sequoias. So I think that, I think that for people planning their local forests, maybe one thing would just be to take a slightly broader view of where things belong. I'm not suggesting that we throw away the concept of nativity and the idea that some species do kind of have these local affinities. But I would suggest that, you know, we're not going to be able to keep all the species arranged as they are. And, you know, places with forests are going to look different, whether it happens slowly and gradually over decades or suddenly and explosively overnight, as with a giant fire, as in 2020. So, you know, I think we need to think about what species, if we're going to be planting things, then we should think about what species are going to work, not just historically, but in a century. And, you know, look at where they occur now. And, you know, I've talked with a lot of ecologists about this, and paleoecologists tend to take a more permissive view of kind of nativity. And so I guess kind of what I've arrived at is, if a species co-occurred with another species in the course of the Pleistocene, so over the last 2.5 million years, when you had tons of climate change, this kind of seesaw of glaciation and deglaciation, if they have a history during that time, they're probably not going to really cause too many problems for each other. So I don't know if that's it doesn't answer the meaning of life, but it's maybe a small start.
What a massive time frame to be able to even name as relevant in the scale of our lives. That's pretty incredible. I would love to hear other people's voices. We did receive a couple of questions in advance, but what has come up for people that you have questions about, please feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead and jump in. You don't need me to call on you, but if you prefer it, you can wave and make movements, and I will. Hi, Anne. I see you waving.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for putting this on. What a great discussion. I enjoyed the book and had a question for you, Zach. Was it difficult to get this published? Was there a feeling that there was a broad enough interest in this topic? I mean, I know those of us who are here are fascinated by it, and most of us have some connection to Tahoe and therefore to trees, and some of us work on climate change issues, and just wondering, you know, how that was. Did you have to convince anybody that this was important and that it had an audience?
Well, if you saw the size of my advance, I'm not sure you'd say that I successfully convinced them. But no, I mean, I think in seriousness of the topic, I think that, for one thing, there was the Richard Powers book about trees a few years ago. There's been a number of other. There was the Secret Lives of Trees. So there's sort of been, I think, in the book world, this kind of consciousness of trees that probably didn't exist 10 years ago. So I think I probably would have had a much harder lift 10 years.
Great regularity. As we're addressing the catastrophic forest challenge. So I love the reference to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the same ancient question.
It's an old one.
A lot of folks have their videos off. If you have your video off, you'll have to actually jump in because I won't be able to see you.
I'll jump in just because you brought up Gilgamesh. I also want to say that recently I've been a part of a Lord of the Rings book club, and we got to the characters of the Ents and their movement when they started to get into the battle between good and evil, and their movement, their slow movement, and what inspired that movement, and how and when they did that. And as I was reading parts of your book, I kept thinking of the trees moving through the forest like that, like making conscious decisions to go in a direction that made, and when you talk about like this moment, is this a moment when there's almost like a reconciliation of where the trees belong? And and that we're just experiencing that, and like our role to intentionally change it, or is it changing intentionally without us participating in it? And I just think that it's a really profound way of looking at the forest that I feel like you just kind of put a finer point on. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me and for the question. Yeah, I mean, I very carefully avoided mentioning the Ents in the book just because it felt, I don't know. I mean, I love Lord of the Rings, but I just was like, I don't know. I didn't want to go there. But
oh no, yeah, I wouldn't suggest that you do, but I that visual was there as you talk about the movement of the trees.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I was totally going for the same. I guess I was playing off the same thing as Tolkien in a way. But yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that what you said about reconciliation is a good way to put it. I mean, you know, species to a certain degree they have a kind of range of climatic situations that they can survive in. And so if the climate shifts, then there's going to be a period of disequilibrium. There's actually evidence now that like many tree species in Europe and North America, at least, have not reached equilibrium from the last time the climate changed, 10,000 years ago. So, but yeah, I mean, we are in a period of more equilibrium and disequilibrium and growing disequilibrium. As far as how forests move, I can't remember. I think I left this out of the book for various reasons, but my favorite illustration of it is I was up in Alaska in, I think, the summer of 2018, which is where I'm from, hanging out with my parents, trying to get the book finished. And I was trying to grow vegetables on their deck. And so I set out a tray of just like various seeds that I planted on their deck. And it was the time of year when all the cottonwoods are in bloom, and there's just like the cotton blowing everywhere. And so before you know it, none of my vegetables came up, but I had a whole forest of little cottonwoods. And I was like, wow, that's crazy that it's just to think that like there's this tiny patch of suitable habitat that I just stuck out there, and they found it right away. And so it was like, for those seeds to have gotten there, an equal number of seeds must have hit every other place. And so I just sort of started thinking about it as kind of like, forests are just kind of like trees kind of have these like fingers that they're putting out, and they're each kind of autonomous, and it's merely the fact of where they land is suitable or not. But in this kind of grasping, groping way, as conditions change, species and trees are popping up in new places, and they're occupying those suitable conditions. So, yeah, I guess that to me was kind of illustrative of how forests actually move, and just kind of this like, it's kind of steered by committee. It's like where the weight of numbers goes is where the species goes.
We did have a question sent to me, and I'll jump in with that. But are there others here now who have a question? So Clark Stevenson, who is not currently with us, but sent this question in advance. And we touched on this a little bit, Zach, but to go a little bit deeper, he writes, excited to hear Zach's commentary about forest migration in a time of ecoregion shift. For me, I am concerned about the carbon loss from wildfire based on land conversions, and what will happen to communities who rely on rec and land management economies with that change. You'd commented on that a little bit around the potential for massive scale landscape change during wildfire. Other thoughts that you might have with regard to the carbon loss from wildfire-based land shifts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, quite frankly, I feel like probably many of the viewers are going to be more versed in some of the aspects than I am. I'm just a reporter, but I guess what I could be more qualified to speak about is that I guess, yeah, I think of kind of the change in forests happening by sort of two not wholly separate routes, but just conceptually separate. And one, I think of like quiet changes. So, talking about conditions slowly change and things pop up in new places, kind of like I set my cottonwoods out, and it's like, when that's happening in the forest, you might not really notice it. And then there's kind of the loud changes is how I think of it. So like huge fires that are beyond anything in the written record. And so these sudden changes, and so people are seeing these kinds of things all over the world. You're seeing ecosystems or patches of ecoregions, I guess, suddenly change from one thing to another. So the example I write about in the book is the boreal forest, which extends in North America from Newfoundland clear to Alaska, dominated by conifers and spruce. And so what scientists and people on the land are seeing now is that used to be fires would come through and it would come back as spruce and you'd eventually get back to the same forest. Now they're starting to be replaced. You'll get a fire and it'll come back as a deciduous forest. And that changes the carbon above ground stocks. It changes the below ground stocks. It changes the ability to hold carbon in the future. So, I think there's these sudden changes in ecosystems that is kind of one of the routes to pervasive change that are inherently unpredictable because they're these threshold type changes, and it seems often are quite carbon intensive. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but that's I think we're in for a lot of sudden and probably carbon heavy changes.
It's kind of encouraging as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about that to hear your reminder that landscapes always change. And, while we are frying seed stock through catastrophic fires, and that can be quite terrifying and sudden, there is also the reality that these forests were always going to change and are ever changing over a slower, as you called it, the quieter changes versus the loud changes. And at this moment in time, I find something about that juxtaposition a little bit comforting when we live so much in the sudden, but perhaps it has the opposite effect on others. I can imagine both sides. Additional questions from others? Leave a space for that, and then if not, we will. I think I just saw, it looked like April unmuted, but that may not have been intentional. Okay. All right, well, in that case, I would like to close mostly by kicking it back to Stacy, but before that, Zach, thank you so much for being here. As we've been speaking, my parents who are here today reminded me of an anecdote from the UK, where my sister went to school, Oxford. It's such an old school. And there was a beam in one of the dining halls, a huge beam of wood that was failing. And it was going to be massively expensive, potentially impossible to replicate what this ancient piece of wood had done to hold up this structure. And they didn't know what to do. And eventually, probably by mistake, they asked the gardener. And because it was a wealthy college, they asked the forester, and the forester said, no problem. When we cut this tree down in 1458, we planted another one, and it's ready. And it was intended to be the beam. And so I like that story just because the time frames of our discussion today and the reminder that we have the opportunity to influence what may not be the many, many thousands of year future, but also the few hundred years future through some small decisions that we make today. So Zach, thank you for being here so much and for diving into your work. For those of you who have not read the book in full, as you can see, I found it very poetic and beautiful. I hope that you get a chance to.
Thanks so much for having me and for your thoughtful questions and for everyone who joined. I really appreciate it.
Zach, that was amazing. And we are so lucky to have you join us this afternoon. And anytime you're in our forest, please do look us up and let us be ambassadors. And maybe we can go and visit the sequoias with you. I received a number of text messages that we're already planning a trip this summer. So it's just exciting
I would love
to
that.
have you invite us to that. So, okay. And I just want to thank everybody here for joining us. I want to see if anyone has anything to share before we wrap up for the afternoon. Okay. It's really good to see y'all. I really miss seeing everybody in person. So soon I will be patient. But until then, we have a couple more salons coming up. And we encourage you to keep joining us. And Zach, you are more than welcome to zoom in on any of our future salons if you want to continue to talk about the forest with us. And for those of you who are new, please reach out if we can answer questions or engage you in this work. And for those of you who keep coming back, we're really glad to see you. Hang in there with us. We'll be in the forest together again soon enough. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. And Teal, great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
That was
Zach.
fun.
Saving the picture of you hugging the tree.